God wants a sacrifice that he can use for service, but Satan wants a sacrifice that he can just use up. Grace and peace, everybody. Welcome to Sabbath School Study Group. This is part 2 of our 5-part series. We're talking about the idea of light here in the book of Philippians. And it's interesting that when you contrast God's way from the devil's way, from Satan's way, or the world's way, God wants a sacrifice that he actually can use for something else. It's like the sacrifice is the path to the iteration of something else, a new beginning. But when Satan demands a sacrifice, it's totally different. He uses or wants a dead sacrifice so he can just use us up. He's trying to claim a soul versus where God is trying to save a soul. But before we unpack this, thank you again for watching. We're on the road here in Louisville, Kentucky at the ministry convention that's taking place here over the course of this week. And it's interesting that when we think about serving or doing what God has called us to do, that's our ministry. God's idea and what he has for us is not just that we would all die for him. Yes, that's a blessing in of itself to be willing to do that. But it's more important, he wants us to live for him. See, when Paul was talking here in Philippians chapter 2, verse 17, he says, yea, and if I be offered upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I joy and rejoice with you all. He was totally willing to be poured out, even to the point not just of exhaustion, but to the end of his earthly existence, and to take his rest in the Lord. That willingness gives him a certain boldness when you have nothing to lose, right? So because of that, there's this kind of confidence that you get. I almost kind of think of it like as we get older, we tend to grow bolder. We can grow bolder as we get older. Matter of fact, just this week, we met a lady who was 80 years old, and she had energy that I've seen 40-year-olds, they can't keep up with her. She was a grandmother. She owns her own beauty salon, yet she's working at the hotel where we were staying as the person who's in charge of the breakfast. And she was on fire for the Lord. And she didn't care what anybody said. And she was praying out loud, singing out loud. And a lot of that probably had to do with, I'm 80 years old. What are you going to tell me that I don't know? And so because of her age and her faith, she was bold. That's why Paul was bold. He was willing to die. But look at this. In Philippians chapter 1, verse 21, he says, for to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. So now look at it. I'm willing to die. There's a gain to that, in that I take my rest and I wait for Jesus to come wake me up. But for me, if it comes to living, to live, that's for Christ. I have a blessing in being able to continue what I'm doing right now. And so for us, when we think about what God is asking for us to do, he wants a living sacrifice so that he can use us, not just for the past, but for the past and the present. This is why I love Romans 12, verse 1, where God says, I beseech you, therefore, through the ministry of Paul, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Just to look at this in this aspect, this is where health comes in. This is the value of health, not just as a ministry, but as your life, eating well, resting well, exercising well, drinking well. All of these things is so that I can perpetuate the degree to which my sacrifice is offered. In fact, remember in the Old Testament, God looked at sacrifices and he would smell them and find a sweet smelling savor. If you have some perfume or if you have good cologne, do you want to put on as little as possible? Do you want to have as little as possible, or you want to get as much as possible? You want to get the biggest bottle you can afford to use it for as long as you can, if that scent is pleasing. You are that scent for the Lord. You are that savor. If you're a believer who's been brought from sin into life, the longer you work, the longer you live, the more he has an opportunity, but more importantly, the longer those who are in the dark get to see a light. The longer those who are in the stench of their own selfishness, when they smell the sweet surrender of someone who has died to self and who's alive unto God, the longer that smell can hopefully encourage them to make the same decision. Remember, to die is gain, but truly to live, that's Christ.